has been with the St. Pete League for 12 years and is the past president of the League of Women Voters of the St. Pete area. She served in the past on the State League Board as well. She also serves as co-chair of the Florida League of Women Voters Task Force on Education. Dr. Kessel is a board-certified psychiatrist and completed her specialty training with the National Institute of Mental Health. Her clinical specialization is in evidence-based medicine, psychopharmacology, pain management, and forensic psychiatry. She is presently a medical officer for a major healthcare insurer. Dr. Kessel has been a lifelong advocate for social justice, women's rights, and expanded healthcare access for all, having engaged in her first legal battle in 1975 as the plaintiff, bringing a Title IX challenge against her school district. We are excited to have Dr. Kessel here with us this afternoon to talk about critical race theory, what it is and is not. Dr. Kessel, we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to address such a broad audience and what I'm sure is a very well-informed audience as well. So thank you for the invitation. I hope we have some, I trust we'll have some vibrant discussion, and hopefully I can introduce a new topic or two, a new point of view. So why are we talking about critical race theory? Haven't we seen the end of Jim Crow? So since the post-World War II, there have been a number of laws that have done away with Jim Crow laws and beaten back remnants of some of our past with slavery, the civil rights movement, and some sentinel legal actions. And so why are we talking about this now? So I just wanted to introduce some facts, and then we'll talk more about critical race theory. In the United States today, African Americans are 1.5 to 7 times as likely to have bad outcomes across broad systems. So this is just talking about health, education, criminal, child welfare, and finance. In addition to that, they are far more likely to not accumulate wealth at the same rate as white households. The average Black household has about 13% of the wealth of a white household. And in death row statistics, something I know a bit about, racial disparity is quite substantial, and it's growing. So for instance, in the death penalty environment, more and more people of color are represented on death row. And in the bottom graph, you can see that when a white victim is the victim of a homicide, the risk of getting the death penalty is very high compared to having a Black victim. So why does this all matter? And here, for those of you who prefer reading the statistics, I do have a slide in here that talks about the things that we just went through. 2.5 times the infant death rate, almost 2 times the rate of dying of diabetes, 1.5 times the rate of low reading proficiency, et cetera, et cetera. Importantly, 7 times more likely to be incarcerated, almost 3 times as likely to have a traffic stop. Interestingly, 2 times as likely to be identified by child welfare as potential to remove the child from the home, etc. Far more likely to be denied a loan by the Small Business Administration, etc. All since Jim Crow laws have in large part been repealed. So what is critical race theory and why is it relevant now? So critical race theory really began as a series of discussions in the 1970s out of the Harvard Law School and evolved into something that we've come to know now as critical race theory. A collection of documents, essays were published by scholars in 1995 in the seminal work called Critical Race Theory, the Key Writings That Form the Movement. It really evolved from Professor Bell's observation that in spite of the removal and rollback of Jim Crow laws, a number of inequities, typically in the legal environment, but also manifest in economics, education, housing, criminal justice, still impacted people of color to a great degree. And he was frustrated with that finding and with failings in the legal system. So out of that emerged the concept of critical race theory. Now we associate critical race theory with Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, also of Harvard, who was the editor and contributor to the seminal work. And basically, critical race theory is a collection of ideas that really espouse that there is and continues to be systemic bias towards Blacks and people of color, particularly in the legal system, that has led to gross disparity and promotes white privilege. In the key writings that form the movement, they very specifically say it is about the regime of white supremacy and its subordination of people of color, and how that system's been maintained in America, again, despite the rollback of Jim Crow laws. So why do white people get so upset about the issue of critical race theory? So in the last few years, critical race theory has been popularized and also weaponized. It is now sort of become synonymous in our popular culture as being, as indicating that America is a white supremacist nation, that it's intent on subordinating and harming people of color, that whites are shameless oppressors and Blacks are victims, that all whites are racists, and that white children, if taught about critical race theory, will hate themselves and their country. So there's been a lot of backlash about critical race theory, and we're going to talk a little bit more about where is critical race theory taught and where does this discussion go. But the backlash has been very severe. It's stoked fears. It's caused school boards and legislatures and boards of eds to tend to ban teaching about racism, as though critical race theory was synonymous with racism, which it is not. Critical race theory is about a system of laws and practices that entrench lack of opportunity in the system, to which people of color are more subject. The penalties to the backlash are very severe. School board members are being threatened. I believe there's at least one in Sarasota County that has been directly threatened. School board members are being recalled. There is now a Florida rule that allows people to record teachers and to potentially turn them in if they teach things that sound like critical race theory. And our commissioner of the Department of Education, Mr. Corcoran, is actually threatening to fire teachers who do not comply. This is a slide I put up that we're going to talk a little bit more about this as our discussion moves on. But this seems largely to split along political lines, not exclusively, but largely. And it's a feature of interest that we'll come back to. So why is this such an issue now? So in 2020, then President Trump issued an executive order to ban the training of racism, sexism, and misogyny in federal workplaces, indicating that it basically promoted racism, sexism, and misogyny rather than undoing it. Consequently, shortly after that, the first bill to reject critical race theory, again, being popularized as synonymous with racism, was introduced in the Utah Congress, and a congressional bill was passed rejecting critical race theory. And since then, you know, I did this talk first in July. At that time, there were 12 states that introduced legislation to reject teaching racism history in schools. And just a few months later, there are 27. And in June of 2021, Florida banned the teaching of racism and critical race theory in K through 12. So that's where we are right now. I want to talk a little bit about some of the history of our education standards. So in 1994, a number of things were passed, including a mandate to teach Holocaust education and African-American education and civics education in the Florida laws. And it evolved in 2020. These things were updated. And you can see on the right that some of the things that were supposed to be taught were to be taught in a manner that allows people to understand the ramifications of prejudice, racism, stereotyping, and bigotry, et cetera. And a task force was formed to make sure that the Holocaust education mandate was delivered in such a way as to protect and nurture the values in Florida that would allow for an understanding of the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. In that same year and through that same revision process, the African American history mandate went into effect as well. And importantly, that was not associated with the same verbiage about teaching tolerance to prejudice and bigotry and the ramifications of those systematized issues, but rather it was very clear that it would be about, and it's in the red on the right at the bottom, the history of African Americans, including the history of African people before political conflicts that led to the development of slavery, passage of African Americans to America, the enslavement experience, abolition, and the contribution of African Americans to society. I think it was presumed, but not explicitly stated, that that would take into account the Holocaust commentary, an examination of what it means to be a responsible and respectful person, as well as to teach in a manner that leads to understanding of the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. But it was not explicitly stated. And there is an African American history task force under the Department of Education in Florida that makes sure that these things are taught in the curriculum. And there are 11 Florida districts that have received an exemplary districts program distinction because of the teaching of those, the history of African Americans in our country. There has been, however, a lot of backlash to updates to those mandates. Now, this is a correlation, but in correlation, there have been a lot of backlash to teaching Holocaust and African American history. In the state of Florida, the Department of Education has invited evangelical Christian rights to offer input into Holocaust education. Christian right groups have conflated Zionism with Judaism and narrowly defined who is a Jew and who is subject to discrimination. They've called the program that's taught in our Florida schools anti-Semitic. At the present time, there are no metrics, no outcomes in Holocaust education, and therefore it's unclear what's actually being taught, but the anti-Semitic hate crimes have gone up substantially in Florida. On the African American history side, the governor and our legislature have embraced, through this concept of critical race theory being conflated with racism, the belief that teaching Black history actually causes racism. This seems to be aligned by political affiliation, although not exclusively. The governor has also invited talking points from conservative and evangelical think tanks about what African-American history should be taught, including the American Legislative Exchange Council on this matter, and has begun to incorporate that thinking into curricula design. And of course, the governor has initiated this executive mandate indicating that critical race theory should not be taught in schools. We've also seen backlash in anti-riot, voter suppression, and critical race theory rhetoric and laws happening across our state. So it's not been without substantial social conflict that these educational mandates that have existed in Florida for quite some time have really begun to cause dissent. All right, so what is the actual rule? So the new rule to the required instruction, planning, and reporting was by executive order and then by the legislature, bans discussion of critical race theory in public schools. Charter schools are not subject to this, this mandate. The governor has asserted that there is no conflict with existing standards. So there are no conflicts with the existing requirements and curricula to teach African-American history in Florida K through 12 schools. And teachers have been banned from sharing their public views on the matter. The governor, in a public statement, made the following statement below, specifically indicating he told the State Board of Ed that he does not want to stop children from learning about slavery or the civil rights movement, but he does want to make sure that they do not hear, quote, narratives that are not grounded in facts, not a false history where they look back and denigrate the founding fathers and denigrate the American Revolution. So he later tweeted that the Florida education system exists to create opportunity for our children and that critical race theory teaches children to hate themselves, each other, and our country, and that it is state-sanctioned racism and has no place in Florida schools. He further referred to the rule as it relates specifically to critical race theory as teachers will not be permitted to tell students what to think, but how to think, that they need to foster an environment where students can think critically and for themselves, that students need to be protected from an indoctrinal point of view, that classroom instruction is factual and objective, etc. So the league offered a response to the governor's mandate and the legislature's rules, whereas they made the statement may not define American history as something other than the creation of a new nation based largely on universal principles stated in the Declaration of Independence. The league offered the language that the Holocaust mandate has enshrined in its narrative, in addition to allowing a single additional part of a sentence. It said, we recommended instruction on the required topics must be factual and objective, something that we all agree on, and it may not suppress or distort significant historical events, something the governor would also agree on. This is, in addition, instruction on the Holocaust, slavery, and Jim Crow laws. So the difference there is that we added slavery and Jim Crow laws, and then everything else resorts to what is enshrined in law in the Holocaust mandate should be taught in a manner that leads to an understanding of the ramifications of prejudice, racism, stereotyping, an examination of what it means to be a responsible and respectful person for the purpose of encouraging tolerance of diversity in a pluralistic society. All of that is already enshrined in the Holocaust mandate narrative, except for the words slavery and Jim Crow laws. So the narrative that critical race theory is synonymous with racism is a false narrative. Critical race theory is not taught in K through 12 now. It is clearly a topic of scholarly academic inquiry at, frankly, the law school level, but is also sometimes taught in graduate schools and sometimes in senior levels of college. It is not a concept that's introduced into K through 12 schools in any form. Critical race theory, the term critical race theory has been misappropriated to create the perception that we are engaging in an anti-white and racially divisive portrayal of history, rather than an honest assessment of our past, opportunity for our future, and teaching African-American history in K through 12. Our educational standards already allow for critical thinking to deliver information to children in cognitively developmentally appropriate stages of their thinking process and learning. So for instance, we have critical thinking in the K through 12 in terms of talking about civic participation. We educate people in the civil rights movement, women's suffragette, etc. And we also talk to students at higher levels about Civil War and Reconstruction, the effects of the American people. These things already exist in K through 12. There's nothing different about them. And again, they're taught at developmentally and cognitively appropriate times, and they're consistent with the curricula that's been accepted and taught for years in Florida that conform to the African American standards and the Holocaust mandate standards. There is nothing in addition proposed to be taught in K through 12. Critical race theory is something not added to the curriculum. It's purely reserved for academic scholarship at higher levels of learning institutions. But again, the concept of critical race theory has been popularized and weaponized to be synonymous with racism, and the concept that teaching about African American history somehow imbibes racism in the learner. I would propose the following topic for our consideration. What other issues have been linked to critical race theory in schools? How are they related, and what purpose does it serve to link them? So I've actually, offered some ideas about that on the right. Freedom of expression. We can't have masks. No mask mandates, no vaccine mandates, no abortion. Many different things have been linked to critical race theory. And in the end, here we have an insurrection, and the flag of the insurrection is a Confederate flag. It's just a provocative comment. What is the purpose of the false narrative linked to critical race theory in schools? Why are they strung together? And what purpose does doing that serve? So this is a fun false narrative. And this is a true article taken right out of the Salt Lake County publication. Who are the heroes and villains of this false narrative? So Salt Lake County actually did a study and associated COVID-19 vaccine rates with zodiac signs. And they came out with some very interesting and potentially relevant findings. They found that astrologic signs significantly predicted who got vaccinated. Fire signs, highly vaccinated. Scorpios, highly unvaccinated. And they developed a narrative around it. Now, it was done for fun, and they did it to make sure that the that the issue of vaccination rates remained alive and of interest in the public's mind. This actually received a lot of very positive attention and really kind of looked at the silliness of how information correlations happen, and how they can also be fun. False narratives can be fun and engaging. They can also be damaging and divisive. So I invite you here to substitute a narrative for something else. Often false narratives have a piece of truth in them. So it makes the narrative easier to hold on to. By this assessment, it is true that Leos have more vaccinations and Scorpios have less. So what might we conclude about Scorpios or Leos, or who might we say are the villains and heroes in this particular false narrative? What is the value? And so I'm proposing to this group that the narrative of critical race theory as being synonymous with teaching people to be racist, and for white people to feel shame, and to be associated with being white supremacist, it's a false narrative. So what is the value of a false narrative? False narratives are often used to sanitize the stories we tell ourselves as we form our identity and sense of ourselves, political understanding, and affiliation. So think of Christopher Columbus landed in the new land and developed a very positive relationship with Native Americans. They engaged in exchange of goods and services and lived comfortably together as the new arrivals to the continent thrived. That's a narrative. It's a false narrative that we tell ourselves to help us form a positive identity, a sense of ourselves, a political understanding, and affiliation to other people who came to America. They're also used to create compelling stories that invoke fear in order to create unity, emotional dependency, and anger. And those emotions and affiliations are used to drive collective action. So I'm almost ready to stop, but I just have a few more slides here. And I want to bring our attention to who are our partners. The League believes and has the position that critical race theory is not synonymous with racism or teaching white people to hate themselves or to see themselves as white supremacists, but rather is an important part of our collective and shared history. And a better understanding of our collective and shared history, for better or worse, will result in a better, more insightful understanding of who we are, where we've come from, and the opportunity to improve our collective path into the future. So as we think about what will we do as League members and as the League to deal with this false narrative, and to make sure that history is taught in a factual and objective way, and that it does contribute to improving tolerance to diversity, to fighting prejudice and bias and racism, and creating citizens who are more thoughtful and capable of engaging in civic exchange in the discharge of their civic duty. Who are our partners? And these are some. Well, we have our Holocaust and our African American Task Force partners. They are still actively pursuing what should be the curricula. The Holocaust Task Force is going to come out with a curriculum hopefully this year. The African American Task Force has a fully executed curriculum with metrics. What will it do to their curriculum, and how will they adapt? We have think tank and pro bono legal and PR partners. We have our community of community activists, Corporate partners should not be underestimated here. There are many corporate partners who have taken a position against the ban on critical race theory in our state and its conflation with racism, and they should be seen as advocates in our desire to teach factual and objective history. Where do school boards and school administrations stand? I don't know that we know that at this time, but we're about to find out because these standards are going to come to pass imminently. And where do our teachers and parents stand? So critical concepts I want to leave us with to start our discussion. We really need to know where the task force, where teachers and school administrators stand on the new civics rules, on how banning critical race theory comports with the mandate to teach Holocaust and African-American history. It's important to know that DeSantis has contradicted himself. These laws are still on the books. There is no detail about what can and cannot be taught. The civics curriculum, the African-American curriculum, the Holocaust curriculum has not yet been modified. There is a new civics curriculum expected to come out in November and to go into effect in 2022. It's not clear how that will impact the teaching of African-American and Holocaust history. We must learn to tell a story, to create a narrative that is true and objective, but allows people to feel an emotional connection to it. And we must draw connections between the reality that this false narrative has been perpetrated for a political agenda. Somewhere along the line, we're going to have to make a financial argument because in large part, money in politics drives the energy behind the false narrative. And then very importantly, the false narrative about critical race theory is about money and power. Subordination and racism are merely tools to unify a voting bloc. I was going to show a short video, but I'm going to suggest that maybe you guys check it out on your own time. It's a wonderful video about the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama, and I'll leave us with the final comment. What can we do now? And I think I've hit my timeline. We've got a good 20 minutes for Q&A, and I will pass it back to Jill to offer questions for discussion. And thank you.
Thank you, Julie. This was truly wonderful. You put together such an impressive presentation, and several people have asked for the slides. I want to remind them that in case you missed the announcement at the beginning, this session is going to be recorded. So the slides will be on that. All the information will be there. The slides themselves, of course, are, you know, it's really up to Julie. Those are hers, and you know, but they will be, you'll have the information from the slides when you access the recording. That should be on the League, the Sarasota League Facebook page and website fairly soon. I did ask people to put their questions in the chat box, and at the moment there are no questions. Let me see. No, there is one question. Questions are beginning to come in. So let me ask Julie questions that are here now. The first one is from Barbara Ryder, who wants to know which corporations are supporting the League's position on CRT in Florida, and how can we strengthen their support?
A great question. I'll get a list of them. I don't have that offhand. And I think the second part of the question is really powerful because in the end, money in politics drives a political agenda, and corporations are annually, there's a letter that that sets the standard for corporations. And in the last 2 years, diversity, equity, and inclusion have become part of that letter, that corporations have a social responsibility to forward diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as a result, many corporations have begun to incorporate that into their values. They are taking action. So it's a great question. I will get that information and provide it to the Sarasota League so that they can make it available to you. Thank you for the question. I think that some of the things that we may need to be doing is engaging those corporations in partnership. Because they represent, first of all, they represent many people. And second, they represent a lot of money. So increasingly, we need to think about partnerships with corporations. I love that question. I'm sorry I wasn't more prepared to provide a more thorough answer for that.
Okay. Here's the next question. This comes from Mary Lynn Parker, who says, I've seen right-wing think tanks conflate CRT with DEI. What do you make of that?
I think that falls right into the false narrative. Remember that a false narrative has a point. The point is to, really, it's a feature of storytelling, and there's a great false narrative that links many different political narratives together in one chain. So what do I think about that? I think that's all part of the plan to link those narratives together to undermine our ability as a nation to become a more just and equitable people.
Okay, thank you. Barb Aaron wants to know, she said, first, thank you for your thoughts, Julie. I'm beginning to think that a way to combat the politicized teaching of history that is sanitized is for the community to offer real history lessons to our children outside of the school system. Your thoughts?
Well, I certainly think that storytelling and narratives from real people with real lived experiences are very powerful. I think they're powerful for children. They're also powerful for adults. And the concept of using lived experience to tell stories that promote a narrative of equity and justice is a phenomenal idea. And you see people doing that in a lot of different social movements, that people tell their own story. It could be a 30-second narrative. It could be a 2-minute narrative. We did that with healthcare. We do it with reproductive rights. We do that in a lot of ways because it's so powerful. I'm wondering whether part of that question had to do with a consideration to promote to not support public schools in combating this particular ban. And I think it's really critical to make sure that our public schools have the right narrative, not the false narrative, and that we do everything that we can to make sure that all children of all colors, white, black, all colors, have an objective and factual narrative that makes them feel positive and hopeful, but does not distort the facts. So yes, we should teach children and other people through compelling narratives and storytelling about real life lived experiences outside the classroom, but we should also teach it inside the classroom.
Sure. Okay, here's a question from Brenda Griffiths, who wants to know, when did the term critical race theory first appear? Isn't it simpler and clearer to state, and I'll put this in quote, African-American and racial history teaching? And finally, what has been taught in the past about African-American history? say 50 years ago?
Critical race theory probably became a coined term in the 90s with the publication of this collection of essays edited by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is also the author of the concept of intersectionality. But it grew from the 70s. I don't think it was called critical race theory until the 90s. And what was the second part of that question?
The second part is, isn't it simpler and clearer to state, and this is in quotes, African American and racial history teaching?
Well, here is the actual mandate, the African American History Mandate. That's what it's called. So it's already called that. This concept of banning critical race theory is a contradiction. And the governor indicates there's no contradiction with African-American teaching of African-American history, so long as it's taught in a way that is consistent with the Constitution and consistent with the values of the founding fathers. That's a contradiction. Mm-hmm. So yes, I think we should call it African-American history. I do not think that we should conflate critical race theory with African-American history. The false narrative is that they are conflatable, that they are the same, and they are not.
Okay, here's a question from Sharon Quitner. Without a very specific and prepared curriculum, the burden on teachers to present this properly is enormous. How will the teaching community be prepared to present this properly?
That's such a great question. Your questions are all very thoughtful, and I'm happy that we're talking a little bit about the narrative of what as well. That particular issue is unresolved, and it might be the place where the League has a role to play. I think it would be important for us to reach out to teachers and school administrators and the African American Task Force and the Holocaust Mandate Task Force and the civics. There is no task force for civics education, but to the people who ultimately have to develop that curriculum to understand, to get a baseline understanding of one, where they stand, what are their concerns, what do they expect, etc. We don't, one of the most, I think, dangerous issues for teachers right now is that if you teach African American history according to the standards in the African American history curricula, you may be wandering into the conflated space of critical race theory, and you may be subject to punishment. We don't know yet. And I think that is our area of opportunity. We have to find a way to, if nothing else, provide clarity for teachers in that area. It's very, very unclear, very shaky ground. In some ways, it's kind of like the Texas abortion mandate, where the Texas abortion rule, where citizens can tell on you, and where everybody's walking on eggshells. That's how teachers likely are experiencing, and I think this is an area where we could learn from teachers. What are they experiencing? I would imagine they have substantial concerns about what they're supposed to say, what they're not supposed to say, how that conflicts with their professional backgrounds on teaching objective and factual things. It certainly is an assault on teachers.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think that's a great idea to get a baseline from these various groups. Teachers I've talked to are certainly very concerned because they just don't know.
You know, much of this could be related, you know, as I think about how the narrative strings together. We have over time, especially in Florida, devalued the role and value of the teacher, right, in the classroom. We've made them have to conform to formulaic curricula. We've stripped them of a degree of their professionalism in being able to teach in a way that they think works best for students or for their students that they're teaching. And in my mind, this is a further erosion of the autonomy and professionalism of the teacher in Florida.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, great response to that question. Here's one from Ruth Brandwine. Her question is, the school board election is coming up next year. It is supposedly nonpartisan. Can we ask questions about candidates' positions on CRT, and if not endorse, then clearly publicize their positions and the leagues?
I don't see why not. I don't see why not. I mean, it's an issue. It's not it happens to be a very politicized issue, but it's an issue. And the league asks questions about issues. We take positions on issues, and we are opposed to this ban on it's an irony. We don't teach critical race thinking in K through 12. It's not taught. So I was going to say we're opposed to the ban on critical race theory in K through 12. We don't teach critical race theory in K through 12. The conflation between African-American history and teaching about our history of race in this country with critical race theory, we are opposed to. It's an issue that we feel very strongly about. We are able to ask candidates about issues.
Okay. All right. Peggy Lichter has asked, can you provide another example in addition to corporate involvement of how critical race theory and money in politics are, will be, or can be connected?
Well, I would offer the example of the Koch brothers and Betsy DeVos' tremendous contribution to candidates who want to ban critical race theory and the teaching of the conflated critical race theory with teaching African-American history, and also their incredible financial support of dismantling public education. I mean, and it isn't a secret that some of the most richest people in America, namely the Koch brothers and the DeVos family, want to do that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Barb Aaron has asked, I agree with the focus on public schools, but I think the community can augment what they are learning. I think you talked about that previously. So I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to add to your comment on community.
I agree. I agree. It's important. It's important for us all to be engaged.
Here's a question from Judy Kraling. Are you aware of any actions by the Florida Council of Social Studies or National Council of Social Studies to work with teachers on how to address this within their classrooms?
I am not aware of that. And if there is such activity happening, it would be important for us to know. So if you're aware of it, please send me a note or call me or something, please.
Okay, and Mary Lynn Parker has put a link for those of you who are looking at your chat box. If you scroll down, NEA has given guidance to teachers. Know your rights, teach the truth. And the link address is there. Ann Moore asks you to please say more about identifying and responding to dis and misinformation.
It's, you know, it's so, this is such a great topic. It's a topic very close to my heart, the false narrative, AKA the product of, not the product of, the end result of mis and disinformation. Mis and disinformation has a purpose, right? To create that false narrative for other reasons, because it unifies people around fear and anger, often, not exclusively, but often. And interestingly, two narratives go up against one another. There's the false narrative and there's the thing you believe is not the false narrative. And there's no room in the middle. And I think that it's increasingly important for us to find a way to have a discussion between the narratives, the one that we see as a false narrative and the narrative we see as a true narrative, to find a way to communicate in a more civil way. But I don't have the answer to that. I don't have the answer. It's a really important, you know, we tend to say, well, just make sure people vote, or we tend to have a conclusion. It is true that often people harboring a false narrative are not persuadable. And that the more you challenge a false narrative, the deeper they dig in, because a false narrative is attached to, there's an emotional attachment to a false narrative and to a narrative that says I'm right or I'm wrong. So it is human nature to attach yourselves to your narrative, whether it's false or true. And sometimes simply digging in is a way to protect yourself from the shame or concern about being wrong. But clearly, we have to find a way to have civil discussions without placing blame.
Great.
But I don't have the right answer for that. There is in other countries, in the Holocaust, in South Africa, and many other countries where horrible things have gone on, like genocide, there's been a truth and reconciliation process, something akin to restorative justice, where groups agree to come together and talk about in a formulaic way the issues that from everyone's point of view on these atrocities, to arrive at a common understanding so that people can come together and move forward. I am a big believer in the restorative justice process and in truth and reconciliation processes as well. But they are hard to organize.
Thank you for
As
that.
a psychiatrist, it is important for people to have their reality and not feel shame about it, and to find common ground together to move forward in a different way.
Thank you, Julie, for that really comprehensive answer. I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to have to just choose a few of these questions. And let's see, this first one is from Catherine Thomas. She asked, can you suggest bullet points we as individuals can use when we find ourselves in conversation with someone who is bought into the false narrative surrounding CRT?
Well, I think that our facilitator is working on some of that now. So hopefully we will have that to share at some point with you. I also want to say it's so important to be respectful, even if you have a lot of emotion attached to your narrative, it's still important to be very respectful, to have a chance of changing the conversation.
Great. Just to respond to what Julie's told you about the work of the task force, a subcommittee on critical race theory on civics and education standards is in fact working on talking points. The subcommittee has now sent those talking points along for the full task force to look at. And I expect at this week's meeting, they will receive those. And then shortly after that, they will probably appear on the State League website as a way of you having these conversations that are so important. But the task force is an amazing group of individuals like Julie, and we'll be giving deep thought to what would be useful for our members to say to people who confront them on this issue. Peggy Lichter has asked, and I think we'll conclude with this question, can you provide contact information should we have additional questions? I'd like to find out more specifically how I might get involved as an individual.
Here is my contact information. Please feel free to contact me. The League of Women Voters of Florida has a statewide Facebook group. If you're a league member, you can join. So we invite you to join. Please join and join our conversation. If you email me and send me your email, I can invite you to that group or give you access to that group. And we have a meeting coming up Thursday evening. Come to the meeting. It's posted in the Facebook group.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Julie. You have been
Thank you for the invitation.
Amazing.
Thank you.
I know that everybody's questions didn't get answered, but hopefully you have learned quite a bit, as I have, and we will continue to be developing talking points and having sessions for leagues on critical race theory, because obviously this is something of great concern. And I hope that some of you will consider, if you're not already a member of Sarasota League, you'll consider joining us. We have a lot of work to do. So thank you all for coming today. We look forward to you at our next session.
Thank you very much.